Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. I'm Meryl Richards. I'm the Program Director of the Food and Forest team here at Ceres. We're a nonprofit organization working with the most influential capital market leaders to solve the world's greatest sustainability challenges. I'm very excited to welcome you to this webinar, which is launching our Deforestation Scorecard, assessing corporate action on deforestation amid growing regulatory risk. We'll hear a little bit more about that later in the webinar. But first, let me go over some logistics and introduce our speakers. So first of all, please note that the session is being recorded. We'll be providing all participants with a link to the recording shortly after completion. The recording will be available for 2 months. So if you have colleagues who couldn't chime in or join in today, feel free to share that with them. We'll also have time for audience Q&A later in the agenda. So if you have any questions throughout the webinar, please enter them in the question and answer box, and they'll stay there until we're ready for the audience Q&A. That box is in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. If you do have a technical question like trouble with audio, please also type that into the Q&A box, and we'll do our best to help you sort it out. If you do need closed captioning, you can select that option in the Zoom toolbar at the bottom of the Zoom screen. And again, if you have trouble finding that, just type into the Q&A box. Next slide. As we are discussing corporate performance, I do need to provide you with this disclaimer. I won't read the whole thing, but I'll let you read it and summarize. So first, competition and antitrust law prohibits agreements and concerted practices that have the object or effect of preventing, restricting, or distorting competition. Ceres does not require or seek collective decision-making or action with respect to acquiring, holding, disposing, and/or voting of securities. Ceres facilitates the exchange of public information, but signatories must not share or exchange non-public, competitively sensitive information. All decisions by investor participants are at their sole discretion and made in their individual capacities. And lastly, Ceres and its investor networks do not act or speak on behalf of each other or other investors, nor do we provide investment or proxy voting recommendations. Next slide. Also, before we get started, an integral focus of the work that we're discussing today is the importance of conserving and protecting the world's forests. I'd like to respectfully acknowledge that Indigenous and Native peoples globally have been caring for and stewarding these forests and other lands for generations, paying attention to the well-being of both people and the environment. Today, Indigenous groups continue to demonstrate effective conservation, and protecting their rights to lands and territories is critical to slowing and halting deforestation. With this statement, we mean to respectfully affirm our commitment to recognize and respect the rights of Indigenous people around the world, including through our own work. Next slide. So again, I want to thank each of you for participating in today's event. I'm especially grateful to our speakers for joining us to share their views and experiences. In alphabetical order by last name, David Dollander is a principal project manager at Proforest. Before joining Proforest, David worked at ISEAL, where he was part of the innovations program with a focus on landscape and jurisdictional approaches. He also led policy and outreach work addressing the relation between regulation and voluntary sustainability tools and initiatives. Dr. Julie Gorte is Senior Vice President for Sustainable Investing at Impax Asset Management. Julie's a Senior Vice President and Senior Vice President of the North American Division of Impax Asset Management Group and Investment Advisor to Impax Funds. She oversees environmental, social, and governance-related research on prospective and current investments, as well as the firm's shareholder engagement and public policy advocacy. Prior to joining Impax, Julie served as Vice President and Chief Social Investment Strategist at Calvert. And lastly, but not least, Christy Rodriguez is an ESG analyst focused on investment stewardship at Legal and General Investment Management. Christy is responsible for LGIM's voting and engagement activity on environmental, social, and governance issues, with a focus on apparel, retail, chemicals, and forestry sectors. Christy also supports in the development of Legal and General's deforestation policy and engagement campaign, and leads on thematic in-depth research and assessment of companies across key sectors using the firm's climate assessment framework. So we have an exciting webinar planned for you today. Let's bring up the agenda. We'll start with some high-level comments from our speakers and an overview of the EU deforestation regulation, or rather EU regulation on deforestation-free products. Then we'll discuss the results of our deforestation scorecard, where we assessed company efforts to eliminate deforestation from their supply chains. Then we'll move into a deeper discussion with David, Julie, and Christy about the regulation and also about investor expectations for company no deforestation action broadly and in response to the EU deforestation regulation. And please do enter your questions into the Q&A box, because finally we'll leave some time for your questions at the end of the panel. So let's pause for a moment before we dive in. We have a quick poll. So let's bring that up. Do you think that companies are ready to meet the requirements of the EU deforestation regulation? So I'll give everyone a minute to vote in that poll. Please go ahead. Okay, let's close the poll, take a look at the results. So it looks like most folks neither disagree that companies are ready for the EU deforestation regulation. Some strongly disagree, and some are unsure, neither agree or disagree, but nobody agrees or strongly agrees. So that's interesting, and I think agrees with what we found in our assessment. So stay tuned for that later in the webinar. But for now, we'll bring on our speakers to talk a little bit about the EU regulation on deforestation-free products and investor expectations for corporate action. So welcome, David, Julie, and Christy. So I'd like to start with Christy. And this question's for Julie as well, but I'll start with Christy. So Legal in General and Impax both recognize deforestation as a crucial engagement theme. Can you share a bit about why it's important that companies are addressing their deforestation risks? So Christy, let's start with you, and then I'll go to Julie.
Thank you, Mariel. For sure. Well, we view deforestation as a systemic risk that permeates through different sectors with significant financial, material, and reputational impacts. And simply put, we cannot deliver climate goals and net zero without addressing emissions from forestry, agriculture, and land use change. And then when you look at it from a system-wide level, nature is estimated to generate about 44 trillion in economic value creation. That's somewhat more than a half of the world's total GDP, moderately or highly dependent on nature. Companies we invest in may be exposed also to deforestation-related risk, which ultimately could affect our clients' assets if left unaddressed. And this exposure most commonly or most often stem from their supply chains.
Thanks, Christy. Now, Julie, let's hear from you.
Kind of hard to add something to a statement as good as that Christy just made, but I will give it a shot. We face two crises that could change life as we know it all over the globe. One is biodiversity loss and one is climate change. Deforestation is a major driver of both of them. We have to address these crises. It is incumbent on humanity to do that. Investors have a role to play in urging companies to do what they can to avoid deforestation. That will not restore biodiversity. It will protect it. And that's where we have to start. And this is, so let's start with what we know, which is to protect the biodiversity that we know exists already and deploy sustainable forest management practices where we are in managed forests as opposed to natural forests. We need to do a whole lot more. I mean, forests are 10% of the globe. So to address biodiversity, we need to address the other 90% as well. But this we know about. This we can start with. We have to start now.
Thanks. Really, really powerful to hear that. I'd also love to hear from each of you a little bit more about your strategy and engagement process for deforestation with companies that you hold. Let's reverse it. Julie, let's start with you, and then Christy.
Sure. So we're committed to eliminate companies' potential our exposure to agricultural commodity-driven deforestation and other forms of deforestation as well in our investment portfolios by 2025. That's public, that's on our website. To address companies' impacts on forests, we use two tools. We have a top-down evaluation tool called the Impax Lens and a bottom-up evaluation tool called ESG 2.0. Both of them address biodiversity and climate risks, including deforestation. The lens identifies biodiversity risk at the sub-industry level, while ESG, it does it at the company level. And we also look for, we have a policy group, which I'm on at Impax, and we also engage with policymakers on policies that would make it more expensive, essentially, to eliminate forests or change the function of existing forest ecosystems. So we're members of several collaborative groups, including the finance sector, commitment to eliminate commodity-driven deforestation, big thing. They will know it as Deforestation-free or FSDA, as well as the Investor Policy Dialogue on Deforestation. We piloted TNFD. We're also a member of the Natural Capital Investment Alliance. Among those three initiatives are included company engagement about deforestation commitments, dialogues with policymakers to create regulations, policies, and guidance that reduce or eliminate deforestation, and helping to create sustainable investment ideas for investing in restoring biodiversity loss as well as protecting it.
Great, thanks, Julie. Christy, let's hear from you.
Thank you. Well, I think, as I mentioned before, we cannot achieve climate goals without addressing affluent emissions. And the greatest potential of reduction comes from eliminating deforestation and forest degradation. So our engagement emphasizes that essential role of combating deforestation in delivering a credible pathway to net zero. Deforestation has been a key focus area for LGIM for several years, since the launch of our Climate Impact Pledge back in 2016, which is our climate engagement program. Deforestation policies have been a core theme of engagement with investee companies in the food and apparel sectors, and more recently with forestry and apparel and pulp sectors. Having a zero deforestation policy is considered a red line or a minimum expectations for companies in these sectors. We take an approach of engagement with consequences, meaning that companies that fail to meet our expectations may have voting implications in their AGMs, and for persistent offenders, we might divest them from applicable funds. Actually, last year we published our deforestation policy, which we have recently updated, and we launched an annual written engagement campaign with key companies. We actually have sent more than 300 letters on this topic so far. And also, for the very first time this proxy season, we applied specific votes on deforestation directed against the chair of the board, which is quite powerful in terms of accountability of board directors on this topic. And this is, again, all part of that commitment we made back in COP26 to use best efforts to tackle commodity-driven deforestation from investment portfolios by 2025, same that Julie mentioned. And our engagement strategy on deforestation actually flows from this commitment. So what we're aiming to do is minimize deforestation exposure across LGIM holdings, which ultimately involves investee companies reducing their own exposure to deforestation. And the way we're putting pressure on them to move is through that engagement with consequences approach. But you will ask how, right? Well, I think we could share a little bit more on this. We actually first look at our holdings, and then we narrow these down to focus on deforestation critical sectors. And these include apparel, agriculture, food, forestry, paper and pulp, home products, among others, or companies that directly or indirectly source palm oil, soy, cattle products, or timber products. And then we leverage metrics from third-party data providers to identify if a company has a deforestation policy and a program in place. And under our policy, this is our minimum expectation. So companies should have both a clear policy and a program of actions to deliver that policy. And ultimately, what we want is that companies identify that deforestation exposure in their operations and supply chains and address it. And that is why, these minimum expectations are linked to voting sanctions. And once we have identified companies that do not meet these minimum expectations for not having a policy or a program, we write a letter to them outlining our expectations and best practice examples. And we aim to do this letter at least a quarter in advance, so they have time to address it. And then one thing that I wanted to mention that you in the beginning, you touched on, Meryl, was the social aspects of deforestation and how addressing this is crucial. That is why we also want to see companies acknowledge the social implications of commodity-driven deforestation, such as indigenous people and land rights, through a human rights policy. And again, we use a metric from a third-party data provider to know if a company has a policy, a human rights policy or not. And even though we're not applying both sanctions yet on this specific topic, this could definitely increase over time. And what we've done is we've sent a letter also to companies that do not have a human rights policy in place. I think one important thing to mention is that, unless we know that a company itself is actually cutting down trees, identifying deforestation exposure is not always straightforward. So to aid on this, similar to the approach that Julie has, we have built a new risk assessment tool that helps us identify and assess investee companies with potential deforestation exposure. And we assess companies based on sector, commodity, geography, and controversies or incidents related to deforestation and human rights in their operations and supply chains. And then we categorize companies as having low, medium, or high potential exposure, which then helps us prioritize our engagement activity. And this whole process has been guided by the Deforestation-free Finance guidance, which we have found quite actually helpful to assess this.
Thank you both, Julie and Christy. I think you touched on some really important themes, especially how deforestation contributes to systemic risk, both via nature, biodiversity loss, climate, social issues. So really great. Thank you. Julie touched on, Impax's engagement and policy. And so I want to turn to David. Most corporate action on deforestation until this point has been voluntary commitments by companies. But the EU is in the process of now implementing the new Deforestation-free Products regulation, called the EUDR for short. Could you provide a high-level overview of the requirements of the EUDR and what it means for companies?
Yeah, thanks, Meryl. And just a quick word on Proforest for those who don't know us. We're a global nonprofit organization that works on responsible and deforestation-free supply chains. And we've been doing that very much from a global perspective. But of course, with the EUDR entering into force now, we're increasingly looking at how these new regulations intersect with some of the global established practices. And so the EUDR was adopted in May of this year. And the primary obligation for companies is that they ensure that any commodities that are in scope of the regulation and that are being placed on the EU market are, one, deforestation free, and then secondly, legally produced. And companies need to do that by attesting for that in a due diligence statement covering any products entering the EU market. And so there's currently 7 commodities in scope. So we have beef and cattle products, cocoa, coffee, soy, palm oil, timber, which includes pulp and paper, and then natural rubber. And the key element of the EUDR is how it defines deforestation and forest. And for that, it uses a December 2020 cutoff date, and it uses the FAO's definition of forested areas. So there's a lot to say about this definition, and we might come back to that later, as it's a critical element of the regulation. Now, to implement this primary obligation, companies need to implement a due diligence system. And a big part of the regulation is dedicated to describing these so-called process obligations in the EUDR. And so these relate to 3 steps. So that is data collection on the commodities that you are buying or sourcing. Risk assessment, so how do you determine if there are deforestation risks linked to those commodities, and then thirdly, mitigation of those risks. And then on top of that, there's a third set of obligations around transparency and kind of internal auditing that are in the regulation. And that means that companies will need to keep internal records, and they will also need to publicly report on the implementation of their due diligence system every year. And so these obligations apply to any company that makes available or places relevant commodities on the EU market. And also, if you're exporting those commodities from the EU market to another country, then that is also in scope. And this means that the EUDR effectively applies also to non-EU countries, right? To international traders or importers or exporters. The regulation distinguishes between operators and traders. These have similar obligations. The difference is that the operators will be the legal entities that are placing a product on the EU market for the first time. And that means they have the obligation to provide that due diligence statement. So that's a very specific and important element. Then the regulation has some exemptions for SMEs, so smaller operators and traders, but only for those in the EU. And essentially, it applies to a very wide range of companies, and the obligations essentially cascade down or up through the supply chain as the information collection needs to come from suppliers. And so really, you will need the whole supply chain to collaborate and share information for EUDR compliance. I think it's an interesting point to note that for some larger downstream companies that are brands or manufacturers, sometimes they actually have less exposure to the EUDR. And that is because some manufactured products are actually not in the list of products that are in scope. So some things like soap, for example, like a processed product, might not be in scope of the EUDR, which means that, again, downstream companies might have less exposure, but their suppliers will have direct legal exposure of the EUDR. And then just to end this overview with the timeline, so the EUDR is going to be, the implementation of it is going to be mandatory from December 2024 onwards. SMEs in the EU have a slightly additional timeframe for about 6 months, but essentially in about 1 year from now, the implementation will be mandatory.
Thanks, David. Really good overview. Good to know what's coming up. Turning to Julie, how do you think, over time, investors' expectations have changed regarding deforestation policies and related disclosures? And how do you think that new regulations like the EUDR change those expectations further?
The long-term systemic change that we've seen in investor expectations is just increasing concern, increasing emphasis, increasing focus on the deleterious impacts of deforestation. So the EUDR is one of the more tangible moves made recently toward using trade policy as a tool to force improvements in environmental management, much like the carbon border adjustment mechanisms. There's other tools as well that have just started to be deployed. The EUDR is one of the more comprehensive and far-reaching tools that we've seen. So it's quite the shot over the bow. These are good faith attempts to improve the quality of environmental management, or at least try to preserve at least what we have still in terms of biodiversity, and to mitigate emissions and reduce biodiversity loss. But they are also somewhat protectionist, frankly, and present additional risk of tensions between countries that could affect many other sectors as well. I mean, the EUDR is a good thing and we need it. It is not, for investors, you can't afford to only look at one side of the issue. You have to look at the whole ball of wax. So, we are a little bit concerned about the fact that several of the commodity producing countries earlier called it neo-colonialist in a fairly pointedly not friendly way. But when it comes to deforestation, very little that we've tried in the past has worked. So it's understandable that those who really want to move the needle on climate change and biodiversity loss would try for stronger mechanisms like this or the Forest Act in the US. The EUDR is the broadest attempt to address deforestation of any existing or proposed policy change, as it addresses all commodity-driven deforestation, both legal and illegal, which is a really important point that David brought up. I want to emphasize that. If it's successful, it's likely to provide at least implicit impetus for other trade policies aimed at climate and biodiversity, and we need everything we can get our hands on right now. So it's a good thing. It's going to be, we hope it's going to be a positive signal for further action to eliminate, to move towards net zero and to reduce biodiversity loss. And this is all stuff that absolutely has to be done, and it has to be done yesterday.
Thanks so much, Julie. So thanks so much to our panelists for a great discussion so far. I'm now going to pivot a little bit and talk a bit about the Deforestation Scorecard, which Ceres is releasing today. I'll present the high-level results, and those findings can be a starting point for the next part of our panel discussion. So let's please bring up that slide. So Ceres conducted this assessment because of this rapidly evolving regulatory environment that Julie and David alluded to is increasing the risk that shareholders are exposed to from deforestation, both with the EUDR. The European Union is also rolling out the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive and the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. And so Ceres assessed companies, a list of 53 companies that are exposed to deforestation and also exposed to the EUDR on whether or not they have no deforestation policies. And I want to mention, this is not necessarily a perfect proxy for EUDR readiness, but it does indicate whether or not a company has a basic policy that would enable them to eliminate deforestation from their supply chains, both to meet requirements of the EUDR and also to meet investor expectations. So we looked at four aspects of a policy, and I'll go through these. So first, cross-commodity no deforestation policy. Most companies that we assessed have some sort of no deforestation policy, but only 18 of the 53 assessed companies have a company-wide no deforestation policy that covers all of the commodities that are subject to the EUDR. So again, a lot of companies may have policies for one or two commodities. It's rare to have coverage of all of the covered commodities under the EUDR. On indicator 2, all supply chain segments in all geographies. We'll talk a little bit about why this is important later, but few companies, only 4, have policies that cover their full supply chains in all their sourcing regions, which could expose them to reputational and market risks from suppliers in regions that are unmonitored or uncovered by the policy. So, some companies may have policies that just address direct suppliers, but not indirect suppliers, or apply to, say, particular geographies in South America, but don't fully cover all of their sourcing regions. Indicator 3, 2025 target date. Julie mentioned this is important to Impax. Also, the EUDR will require full compliance by the end of 2024, actually in advance of this date. Most companies have specified some sort of target date when they intend to fully implement their no deforestation policy, but few, only 8 of these company policies actually have a 2025 target date for implementation, never mind that 2024 deadline that I mentioned. And I should mention, the partial credit that you see here, the 32 companies, those are companies that maybe have a 2025 target date for some commodities or some sourcing regions, but don't fully cover all of the commodities or regions that they source from. Lastly, the 2025 cutoff date that David mentioned, an even smaller number of companies, 5 companies, include a cutoff date that prohibits commodities from being produced on land that was deforested after 2020. And as David mentioned, this is necessary for compliance with new EU regulations, and also remove the incentive for continued deforestation. Again, here the partials are companies that perhaps have a 2020 cutoff date for some commodities or some regions, but not all. So let's go back to our speakers. So first I'm going to start with David. David, with this information in mind, why is the lack of a no deforestation policy an indication that a company is unprepared for the EUDR, and what consequences could unprepared companies stand to face?
Yeah, thanks, Meryl. So I think it's important to stress that companies that have committed and started implementing global deforestation-free policies have a really clear advantage, as they will already have some of the elements in place that relate to these process elements and obligations that I talked about in describing the EUDR. And so importantly, they will have already engaged and worked with their suppliers on deforestation. They will have usually already achieved greater levels of visibility and traceability in those commodities they've been focused on. They will have worked and embedded certification systems that can facilitate compliance. And of course, they might already have experience and exposure to using remote sensing data to monitor what is happening on the ground. And so all of these are kind of the fundamental tools and processes that are also relevant and needed for the EUDR due diligence process. And so if a company hasn't done any of that and hasn't even previously considered this, then of course it is a couple of steps behind, more than a couple of steps probably, than those companies that have already taken and started those processes. And then in terms of the consequences, well, it's fair to say that this regulation does have some teeth. So the fines and penalties can be quite significant, with kind of gradually increasing fines for repeating offenses that can go up to 4% of the annual turnover in the EU. And then there's also other measures that the competent authorities can take in terms of confiscation and recalling incompliant products, putting a freeze on importing or exporting activities of a company, and excluding it from public procurement contracts. So there's quite a wide range of fines and penalties that competent authorities will be able to use.
Great, thanks, David. Julie, our next question targets our next question we'd like to ask you is, while more companies are beginning to develop no deforestation policies and targets, from our scorecard, we see that many companies are still lagging behind, especially when it comes to the specifics of their policies, coverage of all segments of their supply chain across all geographies, which is beyond the requirements of the EUDR, a 2025 or earlier target date, and a 2020 or earlier cutoff date. Could you speak to why each of these criteria are important?
So there's I'm going to sound a little bit like a broken record, so I'll try to talk fast, but there's nothing optional or unimportant in the business of avoiding the twin disasters of climate change and biodiversity loss. We simply have to address them both. Both are problems that have catastrophic impacts globally, and both demand action. And we have long since run out of the comfortable, easy options and vague commitments and things like that. Despite 2.5 decades of global climate change pledges or greenhouse gas reduction pledges, through the COPs, global emissions are still rising, and despite 5 decades of global intentions to reduce biodiversity loss since UNCED, we're still losing it at record rates. Now, to be honest, all new sustainability initiatives start slowly, frankly. I mean, we can't afford to be that slow in the future, but they all start that way. We've seen, for example, this one is starting, and the concern about biodiversity is really kind of ramping up more quickly than climate did. When CDP first started, it took quite a while before we saw a majority of companies paying attention to it and starting to talk about it. And partly that's just because of the urgency of solving the problem. And partly I think it's because companies are more accustomed to investors asking them about sustainability issues. So companies and investors simply have to set our ambitions at loftier levels, and each of these things, covering all the drivers of deforestation, moving up the target dates, reaching farther back in history for cutoff dates, are all in the genre of loftier ambitions. Will that cause pain in the short run? Yes. Will the long run pain of failing to solve these problems dwarf that? Absolutely.
Thank you, Julie. So now, question for either Julie or Christy. We'll start with Christy. But looking at the score distributions of these companies, what does it tell you about their ability to meet your own expectations and EUDR requirements? So Christy, if you want to take this first.
Sure. I think there's a lot of work from them to do on policy coverage, specifically their supply chain. But there's also an opportunity for us as investors to focus our engagement activity on. So I think these results tell us where we need to concentrate engagements more specifically. So looking at the actual quality, coverage, and comprehensiveness of deforestation policies, and ensure that they take into account all these relevant elements, or as you could call them, segments, because this criteria is quite key for having a robust policy and ensuring that we resolve this issue and reduce the risk as much as possible. So yeah.
Thank you. Julie, is there anything that you'd like to add?
Yes, if I can find the mute button. So the thing that jumps out is that very few companies are doing very much, which isn't a surprise, to be honest. I mean, companies always respond slowly to anything that would be a major perturbation to their business model. That said, we have seen companies turn commitments into action fairly rapidly in some cases, so often in the faces of disaster, frankly. Both Japan and Germany, for example, responded to the Fukushima disaster with immediate and deep impact pledges on the use of nuclear power. We saw Europe adjust relatively quickly to a decreased supply of Russian gas. The question isn't whether they can do it, it's whether they will. So everyone, companies, investors, pays a lot more attention to the wolves at the door than to the termites in the basement. So we're always looking for, the problem that's going to affect us in the short run. And that's what humans are wired to do biologically. There's always some argument for postponing a commitment that will pay off only in future decades in favor of attending to whatever the wolf du jour is. The challenge we have to do is just make it clear how much of the threat of deforestation really is a wolf at the door. It's not something we can afford to put off, and why it's worth making into a priority.
Thank you. So now, Christy, if we could go back to you, based on your engagements with LGIM, are there examples you can share of recent company movements that you find encouraging? Could you elaborate on an example of some effective strategies that have been moving companies in this space?
Sure. We actually have a quite good example, and the company is China Mengyu Dairy. This company was divested back in 2021, given the lack of deforestation policies and commitments, especially net zero targets as well. And this year we reinstated the company, given they published a new deforestation policy, and they came out also with net zero targets covering all scopes of emissions, which is actually progressive compared to their peers in China. We have taken an approach of continuing to engage with the company as our deforestation policy still has room for improvement, but we thought that, from being a laggard, they've improved massively to become, within their market, quite good. And in terms of engagement, we have had direct engagement with them for several years, really touching on the importance of having a comprehensive deforestation policy in place, and also within, traceability of their supply chains, specifically on soy for them, soy meal for their cattle. They're a dairy company, so they use a lot of soy to feed their cattle. We just continued engagement, and I guess our approach of engagement with consequences worked, because once they were divested, the turnaround was quite quick. They were divested 2021, and this year they're back into our selected funds. So that has been an approach that actually works for us.
Thank you so much, Christy. And I am back. I apologize, everyone. And thank you, Cal, for taking over. My internet decided to die at that very moment, but hopefully it stays strong. So looking forward, it's clear that there's still significant work to be done when it comes to no deforestation commitments by companies. It's promising to hear some of these stories of success, Christy, that you were talking about. Thinking about the EUDR, what future amendments are likely to be introduced to the regulation, David, and what should companies do to stay ahead of the curve?
Yeah, so I think one kind of blind spot in the EUDR is that the current definition that I was mentioning at the beginning really is not covering some critical ecosystems that are not considered forested areas. And I think we already had a question in the Q&A about that as well. So you have wetlands, grasslands, savannas, that are currently not qualifying as a forest. And so under the EUDR, it's perfectly legal to convert that type of areas, but it might not it might not be it's not legal for, let's say, a farmer to convert areas that they have let's regrow for 10 years between 2010 and 2020. So there's a very kind of imbalance in the regulation in that sense, and the EU will be revising the kind of expansion of scope towards other ecosystems in 2025, if I'm not mistaken. And they might also expand the scope to new commodities and new products. I think it's fair to say that probably first they want to see how companies manage with the current list of commodities that are already in scope before adding a lot more to those. But that's certainly something that will be looked at. I think there's also been some reflection on whether the finance sector directly should have obligations under the EUDR. Not too sure where that stands at the moment. I know for the other kind of horizontal due diligence regulation, there's been a lot of discussion about having direct obligations for the finance sector, and I think we're not seeing that happen immediately for the EUDR. But I think what's important for companies is that they probably want to have a already build in a focus now in their global DCF policies that is broader than just this FAO definition. It already starts looking at protection for other ecosystems. The Cerrado in Brazil is obviously one that has a lot of attention. There's many other ecosystems that are under threat. And so I think that is going to be important for companies to stay ahead of the curve, so to speak.
Thanks so much, David. And what do you expect to hear about deforestation or other policy action on deforestation at COP28?
So I'm not a kind of close COP or climate watcher, but we are, if we're not mistaken, expecting an announcement from Team Europe. So that's kind of a coalition of leading EU member states. And there they will kind of likely announce a new package around the implementation of the EUDR. So kind of a cooperation with third countries and funding for that. But it's, I think, yet unclear how significant this package will be. I think certainly there's been some criticism of the EU that they have not really committed to what they call accompanying measures. So investments and cooperation partnerships around the EUDR's implementation, but that is potentially on. We will hear potentially more about that at COP.
Thanks, David. Should be exciting. The last question is for both Christy and Julie. So Impax and Legal in General are both participants in Nature Action 100, which is a global investor-led initiative on nature and biodiversity loss. Halting deforestation, obviously, as you talked about earlier, fits squarely in the common solution space between climate change and nature loss and also social issues. How do you foresee deforestation fitting into corporate engagements on nature? And I'll start with Julie.
Okay. So our own biodiversity engagements, we've launched a major set of biodiversity engagements this year, new set, in addition to what we were doing before, specifically on deforestation, focus on the company's exposure to biodiversity loss, whatever that comes from, whether it's agriculture or mining or urbanization or wildfire, whatever it is. So there are 5 drivers of biodiversity loss: land use change, pollution, overexploitation, climate change, and invasive species. Every company has a different stone to bring to the edifice when it comes to addressing these drivers. So when we talk to companies that source a lot of commodities like timber or minerals, in addition to agricultural commodities, we always bring up the commitment to zero deforestation and responsible and sustainable forest management in any forested areas, including the good certifications, the most stringent ones for managed areas. But it's much broader, our outreach, than just deforestation. We're addressing all the drivers. So forests serve 10% of the globe. We need to talk about the other 90%. So where deforestation is a significant issue for the company, we always bring it into the conversation, just as we do with all the other drivers. So a part of our new outreach will include pharma companies, which often source, I think the majority of drugs in the world are based on natural alkaloids, right? So there's a lot of sort of borrowing from or learning from nature in producing pharmaceutical products. And at times that can be quite destructive. Taxol, for example, which is a very effective breast cancer treatment drug for some types of breast cancer, is sourced from the Pacific U, which is threatened species, right? So it's not like, we only need to understand the alkaloid, this isn't going to have any impact. It's not like that at all, right? Especially when you are taking, and in some cases patenting, indigenous knowledge to understand the role of that natural organism in being a part of drug therapies or pharmaceutical therapies in the future. So we look at every connection back to impacts and dependencies when we're doing our engagements, including but not limited to deforestation.
Great, thank you, Julie. And Christy, I'll turn to you for this question on nature engagements. And I will say this will be our last question for the panelists from me. So if all of the participants in the webinar have questions, feel free to put those into the Q&A. We've got a few coming in already. Go ahead, Christy.
Thank you, Meryl. Yes, we're part of Nature 100 and nature and biodiversity. Well, deforestation is key to nature and biodiversity. We're actually currently finalizing our approach to nature change, which will feature nature-related topics such as water, circular economy, among other topics, and deforestation will fit into this. And we're working on our engagement strategy going forward, but we will continue with our specific engagement on deforestation as it stands. And within our climate engagement, we will continue to touch on deforestation specifically as well. But yeah, very exciting new year ahead for LGIM on, engagement on these topics.
Thanks, Christy. So clear that deforestation will be part of nature engagements, but those also address a number of broader issues that affect nature. So thank you so much to our panelists. We do have time for a couple questions from the audience. The first one is for both Julie and Christy, and maybe I'll start with Christy on this one. How do your companies verify whether companies' no deforestation policies are being implemented on the ground?
Well, there's several things that companies can do. Traceability systems in place, very, very important. Secondly, have supplier engagement is quite key. And basically, that's one of the main asks that we as the companies, also having monitoring in place, and if having a system for when companies or suppliers breach the policy, so they can identify that and then, have kind of like a clear non-compliance kind of like system as well is quite key. But yeah, just engagement, I guess, within your suppliers is one of the key things we focus on and we encourage companies to have in place, if I had to mention kind of like one of the key ones.
Thanks, Christy. Julie, do you want to tackle this one as well?
Sure. We have whenever you're talking to a company about an issue like this, there's always this sort of, I'm going to channel Gorbachev here, maybe Reagan. I can't remember which one of them is the real author of this, but trust but verify is the principle. So if a company says, yes, we monitor our supply chain, it's kind of like, we will drill down until we can get to exactly how and how much of it and what they report and to whom. Those are four key questions, right? So, okay, how do you know that your supply chain is in good? If the answer is, well, this is what they tell us, it's kind of like, but how do you know? People can tell you lies all the time. And now that we have generative AI, they can do it even more often, even without people in the loop. So the how do you know question, and what mechanisms do you employ to know that? Like, what certifications do you use? Are you in compliance? Is this reported to the board? Is this regularly brought to the attention of the CEO and senior management? Do you report it to investors? Those are all things that we are urging companies to do. Don't just tell me you're fine. Tell me how you know you're fine and how you're not fine. Because frankly, I have been in this business for over 2 decades. I have yet to encounter a perfect company. If you find one, please feel free to give me a call. But, you know, I think when companies are upfront about their challenges and say, look, we're not sure, or this is where we have problems monitoring this, we are much more likely to believe all the good things you say that you do if you admit to the places where you have challenges than if you're a routine picture of perfection, which we frankly don't believe.
Thanks, Julie and Christy. So that was a great summary of how investors are verifying implementation of no deforestation policies. We also got a question in the chat about how EUDR is ensuring or tracking compliance. So this is for David. Can you elaborate on how the EUDR plans on ensuring or tracking compliance from companies, specifically with regards to their geolocation requirements that suppliers, traders will have to provide, specifically to prove that it's deforestation free?
Yeah, thanks. And so this is when I was talking earlier about the data collection that needs to happen under EUDR. This is part of that. And I think here we're really touching on one of the most challenging aspects of the EUDR's implementation, because it requires companies to collect traceability data to the land plot where a commodity was produced, and then assess and verify if that land plot was forested before December 2020. And so this is quite a high burden of proof in terms of the information that needs to be provided, and an enormous amount of information will need to be channeled through supply chains to manage that. And it assumes that you have all the land plots clearly mapped out, which is not always the case. And it is also assumes there's no mixing with other commodities where you don't have the same level of information. And most commodity supply chains are based on mixing and a lot of processing at different stages of the supply chain. So that is really a very practical but critical challenge around the EUDR. And I think it also relates to potentially some of the EUDR's kind of limitations as well, but I'll perhaps leave that for a next question.
Thanks, David. We have another question coming in. This is about certification schemes. So this could be for any of you actually who want to weigh in. A certification scheme such as RSPO won't be sufficient for EUDR. Legal responsibility for due diligence is with the first importer, which cannot depend on certification. Shouldn't we be encouraging companies to conduct their own efforts to get to 100% traceability to the plantation instead of depending solely on RSPO? Of course, RSPO or other certifications, and I shouldn't be using the acronym, Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil is what I mean by RSPO. Of course, that's a useful source, but not something that can be depended on for compliance with the EUDR. How have you thought about assessing companies or understanding them in terms of their own traceability journeys? Thanks. So would any of the speakers like to tackle that one? Perhaps I'll call on David. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm happy to comment on that. I think certification schemes are going to be, I think, an important part of EUDR compliance, but also importantly, they essentially go beyond EUDR compliance already, right? So in terms of the types of issues they look at, in terms of the incentives that they can provide to producers, but also because they are based on kind of a more collective understanding. And so as a company, if you want to do away with the use of certification systems and completely replace that with a tailor-made kind of supply chain program, then you're going to be doing a lot of duplication, which probably can be avoided as well. So the challenge with existing certification systems is that they're currently not yet completely adapted to providing all the relevant EUDR compliant information. Now, RSPO and many others are looking into that. They're developing new systems, new platforms to enable that information sharing. But the EUDR is also very clear that companies don't have to use certification systems. They can indeed get that information in other ways. But again, I think it's important here to recognize that a multiplication of demands on suppliers and producers is not always the most effective way to do this. And that's why certification systems with a wide uptake are probably going to be a really important tool to facilitate that EUDR compliance in the future.
Great, thank you so much, David. So that's about all the time we have for Q&A from the audience, but thanks to all of the participants for your participation and your great questions. And I want to thank all of you for just taking part in today's event, and a special thanks to David, Julie, and Christy for joining us. For everyone online, please note that you will receive a follow-up email with a recording of this session shortly. So as I said earlier, if you have colleagues who missed the live event, feel free to share that with them. And again, you can learn more about the Deforestation Scorecard and Ceres' broader deforestation workstream at the address that we put into the chat earlier. Before we close, I also want to note a few important initiatives and upcoming events. So let's bring up those slides. Thanks. So first of all, we urge any companies or investors on the line to sign the Freedom to Invest statement and join 250 leading investors and companies to call on policymakers to protect the freedom to invest responsibly. Go to freedomtoinvest.org to learn more. Next slide. You can also stay up to date on all of Ceres' latest sustainability research by visiting our website at the address you see here. And of course, you can find the Deforestation Scorecard at the top of that website right now. Next slide. Lastly, we hope to see all of you or some of you at one of our many COP28 events. There are some exciting developments happening related to deforestation, and there will be a number of events related to nature, land use change. Ceres experts will be highlighting the impact of recent U.S. climate policy wins and the work of its global initiatives on mobilizing private sector action on climate change, water scarcity, and nature loss. So you can visit that address. And very lastly, next slide, please take a moment to take a quick survey so we can continue to host thoughtful and engaging webinars like this one. You can scan the QR code or visit the link that we're dropping into the chat. We really do value your feedback. So thank you all so much for joining, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.